A 25-year-old woman named Alexia stands in her doorway at dawn, staring at the fresh human excrement smeared across her home's entrance. This is the third time this week. The message is clear. She is no longer welcome among the living. Her crime. Her husband fled from battle 6 months ago, instead of dying with honor. But what the Spartan state is about to do to her will make you question everything you thought you knew about human civilization. Because what I'm about to reveal isn't just historical cruelty. It's a systematic program of psychological, physical, and sexual torture so devastating that many of these women begged their tormentors to just kill them and end their suffering. But death was a mercy the Spartans refused to grant. They had discovered something far more powerful than execution, a fate so horrible that warriors would literally throw themselves on enemy spears rather than subject their families to what was coming. The Spartans didn't just punish failure, they weaponized human suffering, turning women into living examples of what happened when you disappointed the state. And the methods they used were so brutal, so psychologically sophisticated, that they would make modern torture experts recoil in horror. Fair warning, what you're about to hear contains details so disturbing that several historians refuse to study this topic. The evidence comes from archaeological findings, legal documents, and eyewitness accounts that paint a picture of human cruelty so extreme it challenges our understanding of what supposedly civilized people are capable of. This isn't just about ancient history. It's about the terrifying truth of what humans will do to each other when society gives them permission to torture the innocent. And by the end of this video, you'll understand why some fates truly are worse than death. Let me take you back to 425 BCE, to a morning that would change Alexia's life forever. She's grinding barley in her kitchen when she hears the commotion outside, voices shouting, people running. Her neighbor Cleomenes bursts through her door without knocking, his face pale with terror. "They're back," he whispers. "The survivors from Sphacteria are back." The Battle of Sphacteria was supposed to be a glorious Spartan victory. Instead, 120 Spartan warriors, men who had sworn to return with their shields or on them, had surrendered to the Athenians rather than fight to the death. They had chosen life over honor, and now they were returning home to face judgment. But the real judgment wouldn't fall on them. It would fall on their wives. Alexia's husband Lysander was among those survivors. For 20 years, she had been a respected citizen wife of Sparta, mother to 2 promising sons, a woman who commanded respect wherever she went. In less than an hour, she would become something else entirely, a breathing symbol of shame, marked for systematic destruction by her own society. The transformation began the moment the defeated warriors entered the city gates. Alexia could see her husband among them, his head shaved in humiliation, his body bearing the scars of captivity. But she barely recognized the broken man shuffling toward her. The proud warrior she had married was gone, replaced by someone who wouldn't even meet her eyes. The crowd that followed the returning warriors wasn't there to welcome them home. They were there to witness the beginning of a carefully orchestrated campaign of terror that would consume not just the defeated men, but everyone connected to them. Wives, children, elderly parents, all would be sacrificed to preserve Sparta's reputation for invincibility. Within minutes of Lysander's return, the ephor's messengers arrived at Alexia's door. She was summoned immediately to appear before the tribunal, not to receive comfort for her husband's ordeal, but to be formally stripped of everything that had defined her existence. Her status as a citizen wife, her property rights, her position in society, even her name, all would be taken from her in a public ceremony designed to maximize humiliation. The tribunal wasn't interested in justice or even punishment in any rational sense. This was ritual degradation, a carefully choreographed spectacle that would serve as entertainment for the Spartan masses and a warning to every wife and mother in the city. Fail to produce a warrior worthy of Sparta, and this is what awaits you. As Alexia was dragged from her home, her 2 teenage sons watched from the doorway. They didn't run to comfort their mother because they couldn't. Touching her now would contaminate them with her shame. Instead, they stood frozen, watching as their entire world collapsed around. By sunset, they would be orphans in all but name, their mother transformed into something less than human, their future destroyed by their father's moment of weakness. 20 years in the future, But this was just the beginning. What the Spartans had planned for Alexia and the other wives would make this initial humiliation seem like mercy. The tribunal chamber reeked of unwashed bodies and stale wine. 5 ephors sat behind a blood-stained table, their faces showing the kind of cold satisfaction that comes from having absolute power over another human being. Around the chamber, dozens of Spartan citizens had gathered not to witness justice, but to participate in a festival of cruelty that would last for hours. When Alexia was shoved before the tribunal, she tried to maintain her dignity. 20 years as a Spartan wife had taught her to endure hardship without complaint, but nothing had prepared her for what was coming. The charges against her husband were read aloud in excruciating detail. Every moment of cowardice, every failure to die gloriously, every choice to live rather than achieve heroic death was dissected before the jeering crowd. But these weren't charges against Lysander, they were charges against... In Spartan logic, a true warrior's wife would have rather seen her husband dead than disgraced. By accepting his return, by showing joy at his survival, she had proven herself complicit in his cowardice. The first punishment was deceptively simple. Alexia was ordered to remove her clothing piece by piece before the assembled crowd. This wasn't just public nudity, it was ritual stripping of her identity. Each garment that fell to the floor took with it another aspect of her former life. The fine chiton that marked her as a citizen wife, the jewelry that indicated her family's wealth, the carefully arranged hair that showed her status as a respectable woman. When she stood naked before the crowd, something in their demeanor shifted. The formal proceedings gave way to something more primal, more savage. Someone in the crowd shouted, "Whore of a coward!" And suddenly the chamber erupted in a frenzy of verbal abuse that would have made sailors blush. But the words were just the beginning. The ephors announced her new status. She was no longer Alexia, wife of Lysander. She was now simply disgraced woman number 7, not even worthy of a name. She would wear the rough grey robes of the shameful, mark her face with ash each morning, and live according to rules designed to remind everyone of her husband's failure. But then came the announcement that would haunt her dreams forever. Because Sparta could not allow the pollution of cowardice to spread, she would be made available for purification by any citizen warrior who wished to cleanse her contamination through physical correction. The clinical language couldn't disguise the horrific reality. Alexia had just been declared public property, available for rape and abuse by anyone who claimed to be serving the state. The crowd's reaction was immediate and terrifying. Men began shouting claims, arguing over who would have first access to this new form of entertainment. Women in the crowd, wives and mothers who should have shown solidarity, screamed their own abuse, proving their loyalty to Spartan values by calling for ever more creative torments. As Alexia stood naked and trembling before this baying mob, she finally understood the true genius of Spartan cruelty. They weren't going to kill her quickly and let her suffering end. They were going to keep her alive for years, decades even, as a living reminder of what happened to those who failed the state. Every day would bring new humiliations, new torments, new reasons to wish for the death that would never come. But the worst was still ahead of her. The purification ceremonies began immediately. Alexia was dragged from the tribunal chamber to a specially prepared area behind the temple of Artemis, where a crowd had already gathered to witness her first official correction. The location was deliberate, a sacred space corrupted by the presence of the unworthy, adding religious transgression to her catalogue of sins. The first corrector was a young warrior named Brasidas who had distinguished himself in recent battles. He approached Alexia not with the furtive shame of a criminal, but with the proud bearing of a man performing a civic duty. In his mind, and in the minds of the cheering crowd, what he was about to do wasn't assault. It was healing. He was cleansing the community of contamination through violence. What followed was ritualized gang rape conducted in full view of hundreds of spectators who cheered each violation as if it were a sporting event. But this wasn't random sexual violence. It was carefully orchestrated psychological warfare designed to break not just Alexia's body, but her spirit. Each assault was accompanied by forced confessions, where she had to declare her husband a coward and herself grateful for correction. Physical torture was complemented by psychological torments that revealed the sophisticated cruelty of Spartan social engineering. As Alexia was violated, she was forced to watch as her personal possessions were distributed among the crowd as trophies. Her wedding jewelry was pulled apart and given to young girls as rewards for their loyalty to Spartan values. Her household gods were smashed while she was made to thank the destroyers for freeing her from contaminated objects. But perhaps most devastating was the forced participation of other women. The wives of successful warriors were encouraged to join in Alexia's humiliation, proving their own virtue by contrast. These women, some of whom had been her friends, competed to devise creative torments. They pulled her hair, spat in her face, and carved symbols of shame into her skin with their fingernails. The sisterhood of Spartan womanhood had transformed into a pack of predators, each trying to prove her own righteousness by outdoing the others in cruelty. The children forced to witness these scenes represented another layer of calculated psychological warfare. Young boys were brought to see what happened to the families of cowards, learning that failure in battle would doom not just themselves, but everyone they loved. Young girls learned that their bodies and dignity depended entirely on their future husband's military success. The trauma was deliberately intergenerational, designed to ensure that the fear of such a fate would motivate Spartan warriors for decades to come. As the hours passed and Alexia's body was broken by repeated assault, something worse than physical pain began to consume her. The realization that this wasn't an aberration or the result of mob passion, this was official state policy planned and endorsed by the highest authorities in Sparta. Every violation had been sanctioned, every torment approved, every humiliation designed by people who saw themselves as the pinnacle of civilization. The medical evidence discovered in archaeological excavations of Spartan burial sites confirms the horrific reality of what these women endured. Skeletal remains of women identified as wives of defeated warriors show evidence of repeated trauma, broken bones that healed poorly, skull fractures consistent with systematic beatings, and pelvic damage that speaks to sexual violence so severe it permanently disabled its victims. But the physical torture was only the beginning. The Spartans had discovered that the most effective way to control a population wasn't through the fear of death, but through the fear of a life not worth living. They had turned human suffering into a science, with specialists who studied the most effective ways to break the human spirit while keeping the body alive to endure more punishment. The economic warfare waged against these women represented another dimension of their systematic destruction. Within days of her husband's disgrace, Alexia found herself cut off from every source of support that had sustained her previous life. The helots who worked her family's land were reassigned to loyal families, leaving her without the agricultural production that had provided her income. But losing the land was just the beginning. The complex web of reciprocal obligations that bound Spartan society together, loans, favors, promises of support, all evaporated overnight. Debts owed to her became uncollectible because no court would enforce the rights of the disgraced. Money she had lent to neighbors was simply forgotten, with the borrowers claiming that contaminated wealth had no legal standing. The systematic exclusion from economic life was so complete that Alexia couldn't even beg effectively. The traditional spots where the destitute might gather to seek charity were forbidden to her. Markets closed their stalls when she approached. Even the Pariosai, the non-citizen inhabitants of Laconia, who occupied the lowest rung of Spartan society, were warned against trading with her lest they face punishment themselves. This economic isolation forced the wives of defeated warriors into increasingly desperate survival strategies. Some attempted to practice trades considered beneath Spartan women, weaving and cleaning, but even these options were limited. Guild associations could refuse membership to the disgraced, and customers risked social consequences for patronizing them. Archaeological evidence from this period shows a marked increase in malnutrition among women in this category. Bone analysis reveals chronic hunger, vitamin deficiencies, and the kind of physical stress that comes from constant food insecurity. These women were being starved by their own society, slowly weakened until they became even more vulnerable to the physical and sexual violence that was their daily reality. The few possessions they managed to retain became targets for sanctioned theft. Young Spartan men would break into their homes, not as criminals but as citizens performing community service by removing contaminated objects from circulation. Furniture, cooking vessels, Even basic tools were confiscated on the grounds that they had been polluted by association with cowardice. But perhaps most cruelly, their children became economic weapons turned against them. Sons old enough for military training were taken away to join the agoge, where they would be taught to despise their father's memory and their mother's existence. Daughters were declared unmarriageable within respectable Spartan society, but they could be sold to foreign merchants or given to Periosias concubines. Mothers had to watch as their children were distributed like livestock, knowing that any attempt to resist would result in even harsher treatment. The bureaucratic precision with which this economic destruction was carried out reveals the systematic nature of Spartan cruelty. Officials maintained detailed records of confiscated property, tracking every bowl, every garment, every tool that was taken from the disgraced. These inventories weren't just administrative convenience. They were part of the psychological torture, formal documentation of how completely these women had been erased from civilized society. The economic warfare served a dual purpose. It ensured that the wives of defeated warriors remained visible in their poverty as warnings to others, while also providing material benefits to the loyal citizens who received their confiscated property. The systematic redistribution of wealth from the disgraced to the faithful created an incentive structure that encouraged citizens to participate enthusiastically in the persecution of their former neighbors. The most sophisticated and psychologically devastating aspect of Sparta's campaign against the wives of defeated warriors was the systematic destruction of their maternal bonds. The state had discovered that a woman could endure almost any personal torture if she believed she was protecting her children. So they made her children into weapons against her, turning the most fundamental human relationship into a source of unbearable pain. The process began with forced separation. Sons were taken for military training earlier than usual, removed from their mother's influence before contamination could spread. But this wasn't simple separation. It was deliberate psychological torture designed to break the maternal bond while traumatizing both mother and child. Alexia's two sons, Marcus and Demetrius, were dragged from their home while she was held back by guards. The boys, barely teenagers, called out for their mother as they were loaded onto carts like cargo. But she was forbidden from comforting them, forbidden from even acknowledging their distress. Any attempt to show maternal feeling was treated as evidence of the weakness that had infected their household. In the agoge, these boys faced a specially designed curriculum of abuse that went far beyond the notorious harshness of regular Spartan training. They were isolated from other students, fed less, beaten more frequently, and subjected to psychological torments designed to make them hate their own family. Instructors would force them to recite their father's failures each morning, to spit on portraits of their parents, to compete against each other for the privilege of denouncing their family's disgrace. But the cruelest aspect was the use of the children as informants. The boys were told that they could redeem their family's honor by reporting on their mother's activities, her conversations, her attempts to maintain contact with other disgraced families. They were rewarded for betraying her, given extra food and better treatment when they provided information that could be used against her. The psychological pressure on these children was unbearable. They were simultaneously expected to hate their mother and prove their loyalty by destroying her, while also carrying the burden of their father's shame and their own contaminated bloodline. Many broke under the stress, fulfilling the prophecy of inherited weakness through suicide or complete mental collapse. For daughters, the torment took different but equally devastating forms. Alexia's daughter, Helena, was kept at home, but not out of mercy. She was being prepared for a fate that would serve as ongoing torture for her mother. She would be given to the helots as a breeding slave, her noble blood mixed with that of the enslaved to produce future servants for the state. The preparation process was designed to maximize maternal anguish. Helena was gradually degraded, her education stopped, her clothing replaced with the rough garments of the enslaved, her diet reduced to helot rations. Alexia was forced to watch as her daughter was systematically reduced from a future citizen wife to livestock, knowing that any attempt to intervene would only make things worse. The state also used false hope as a weapon. Periodically, officials would hint that exceptional performance by the children could lead to family redemption. They would suggest that if Marcus excelled in training, if Demetrius showed particular courage, if Helena accepted her fate with appropriate gratitude, the family's status might be reconsidered. These hints were lies, designed to keep the children striving and the mothers hoping. No family was ever truly redeemed. The contamination of cowardice was considered permanent, but the false hope served its purpose, keeping the victims compliant while providing endless opportunities for fresh disappointment and renewed despair. Perhaps most devastating were the mandatory family visits that were arranged periodically as part of the psychological torture program. Once every few months, Alexia would be permitted to see her children, but under conditions designed to maximize pain for all involved. These visits took place in public, under heavy guard, with crowds of citizens encouraged to watch and comment. The children were coached to show contempt for their mother, to flinch from her touch, to repeat the propaganda they had been taught about her worthlessness. Alexia was forced to watch as her own children performed hatred for her, knowing that they were being destroyed by the same system that was destroying her. The children's obvious distress, visible through their performed cruelty, made these encounters even more agonizing. She could see the fear in their eyes, the confusion and pain they were trying to hide. They were as much victims as she was, but they had been turned into instruments of her torture, forced to participate in their own family's destruction. The long-term psychological effects on children raised in this system were catastrophic. Those who survived to adulthood carried trauma that manifested in extreme aggression, complete submission to authority, or profound depression. Many never formed healthy relationships, never learned to trust or love, never escaped the psychological prison that had been built around them in childhood. The suicide rate among these children was noted by several ancient sources as remarkably high. They were caught between impossible demands: hate your family, but prove yourself worthy of belonging to Sparta. Deny your bloodline, but somehow transcend its supposed weakness. Participate in your mother's torture, but maintain some sense of your own humanity. Some children, broken by the psychological pressure, would inform not just on their mothers, but on each other, competing to prove their loyalty by betraying siblings who showed signs of insufficient hatred for their family. The state had successfully turned children into weapons against their own relatives, destroying the most fundamental bonds of human society in service of military ideology. The treatment of these children reveals the ultimate goal of Sparta's system, not just punishment of failure, but the complete reconstruction of human nature itself. They were attempting to breed out compassion, to create a society where love and loyalty could be turned on and off based on state approval, where human beings could be conditioned to torture their own family members without emotional consequence. The system's ultimate failure is demonstrated by Sparta's eventual collapse, a society that systematically destroyed its own families, that turned children against mothers and mothers against children, could not sustain itself indefinitely. The demographic decline that eventually doomed Sparta was not just numerical, it was spiritual. They had created a population incapable of the trust and cooperation necessary for long-term survival. As we near the end of this journey into the darkest depths of human cruelty, we must confront the most chilling aspect of the Spartan system, its effectiveness. The treatment of defeated warriors' wives achieved exactly what it was designed to do. It created a fear so profound, so all-consuming, that Spartan warriors would indeed choose death over the possibility of subjecting their families to such torture. The system worked because it understood something fundamental about human psychology, that we can often endure suffering ourselves better than we can endure watching our loved ones suffer. By making military failure a family disease that would destroy everyone connected to the warrior, Sparta ensured that its soldiers would fight with desperate ferocity, knowing that surrender would doom not just themselves, but their wives, children, and future generations. But this effectiveness came at a price that ultimately destroyed Sparta itself. A society built on such systematic cruelty could not maintain the trust and social cohesion necessary for long-term survival. The fear that motivated warriors also poisoned relationships, destroyed families, and created a population more concerned with avoiding punishment than with genuine loyalty or patriotism. The demographic decline that doomed Sparta was not random misfortune, but the inevitable result of a system that systematically destroyed its own families. Every wife driven to suicide, every child broken by psychological torture, every family eliminated by state cruelty represented a loss to the Spartan citizen body that could never be replaced. The archaeological evidence tells a grim story of a society in decline. Burial sites from later periods show increased evidence of violent death, malnutrition, and social breakdown. The careful social engineering that had once made Sparta invincible had turned inward, consuming the society it was meant to protect. Modern psychological research helps us understand why such a system was doomed to fail. Societies built on sustained cruelty and systematic dehumanization create trauma that persists across generations. The children raised in such environments struggle to form healthy relationships, to trust institutions, or to maintain the social bonds that hold communities together. The wives of defeated Spartan warriors, whose suffering we have examined in such painful detail, were not just victims of ancient cruelty, they were canaries in the coal mine, early indicators of a social system that had become toxic to its own survival. Their treatment reveals the ultimate contradiction in Sparta's ideology. A society that claimed to value strength above all else had created a system that made everyone weak. The true measure of their suffering lies not just in the physical and psychological torture they endured, but in the meaninglessness of their sacrifice. They were not martyrs whose deaths inspired change, not heroes whose resistance sparked revolution. They were simply victims of a system that viewed their pain as necessary and their humanity as expendable. Yet in remembering their stories, in refusing to let their suffering disappear into historical obscurity, we honor not just their memory, but our own humanity. We acknowledge that the true strength of a society lies not in its capacity for cruelty, but in its willingness to protect the vulnerable and maintain human dignity, even in the face of failure. The wives of defeated Spartan warriors teach us that some fates truly are worse than death, not because death is easy, but because there are forms of living that destroy everything that makes life worth having. They remind us that the greatest victories are often moral rather than military, and that the societies we most admire are those that choose compassion over cruelty, mercy over vengeance, humanity over ideology. Their voices, silenced by centuries of historical neglect, carry a warning that echoes across time. Beware of any system that asks you to sacrifice your humanity for the promise of strength, that demands you torture the innocent to prove your loyalty. That turns love itself into a weapon of state control. In the end, Sparta fell not because its enemies were stronger, but because it had destroyed the very human connections that make a society worth defending. The empire built on the suffering of innocent women and children could not stand, for no foundation built on such injustice ever can. What do you think? Could any ideology justify the systematic torture of innocent women and children? How far would you go to protect your family from such a fate? Share your thoughts in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe for more dark truths about human nature that history tried to hide.